welcome to AviaDev Inside Africa. This is the episode number 188. We have a special episode for you in the light of the recent events with the new variant which was discovered in South Africa. We have our guest today, Dirk Singer, and we have both two moderators today. So it's myself, Juraj Todt, Managing Director, AviaDev Europe, and John Howell, CEO and founder of AviaDev Africa.
Hi, everybody, and this is a great episode. Just trying to get to the bottom of what's happening with Omicron, and Dirk is a respected voice on the subject, so do enjoy it.
Today we have a special episode for you with Dirk Singer, Head of Research at Simpliflying, who has been covering the implications of pandemic on the world of travel since the early days. And also today, Dirk is very actively commenting and explaining the current situation on LinkedIn and also on Simpliflying Corona Weekly newsletter. So on 26 November, we heard the first news about the new variant of COVID-19, which was discovered by the scientists in South Africa, and later it was named Omicron by World Health Organization. What followed was a very quick reaction of the international community that immediately banned flights from South Africa and other African countries, and that list is already very long. It includes UK, European Union, Israel, US, and in total over 70 countries and territories. In the meantime, of course, the new variant was already confirmed in Israel, Belgium, Scotland, Spain, Portugal, Denmark, Netherlands, Germany, Czech Republic, Japan, Australia, South Africa, and Botswana. So still early days, and many people are saying there is a lot we don't know about the new variant yet, but certainly there are some things we do know already. So Dirk, what information we have today? We are recording in the morning of 30th November 2021.
Well, the situation seems to change all the time. I mean, overnight there was an interview by Moderna's chief executive with the Financial Times, which has apparently spooked the markets quite a lot, where he said that that the signs are not good in terms of the efficacy of the vaccines against the new variant. Now, obviously, he did caveat by saying that. We don't know to what extent that will be, and it's really too early to tell. But that's kind of gone against some of the more optimistic news that we were hearing from South Africa, which obviously said that most cases so far that have been detected have been mild. Of course, I mean the two both can be true. It can be true that that the new variant breaks through the existing vaccines, and also that people who get it display quite mild symptoms, but that has knocked sentiment back a little bit, especially as you said. Obviously, by the time that we mass produce these things, it'll be sometime in Q1 2022 before we get them out in any large quantities.
Absolutely. And the travel bans will damage the economy of many African countries, especially South Africa, where they were all looking forward to a nice summer season. And your general view in Simplifying is that travel bans are wrong and ineffective. And this is also what Dr. Ayoade Alakija from Africa Vaccine Delivery Alliance has said a few days ago on BBC. So let's hear from Dr. Alakija.
What is going on right now is inevitable. It's as a result of the world's failure to vaccinate in an equitable, urgent, and speedy manner. It is as a result of hoarding by high-income countries of the world. And quite frankly, it is unacceptable. These travel bans are based in politics and not in science. It is wrong. Why are we locking away Africa when this virus is already on 3 continents? Nobody's locking away Belgium. Nobody's locking away Israel. Why are we locking away Africa? It is wrong. And it is also time that our African leaders stand up and they find their voice. African leadership need to sit up in this moment. Our presidents need to wake up in this moment and realize that this is not business as usual. Their continent is at stake. Our lives are at stake. And we cannot allow the world to do this to us.
So what's your take on that, Dirk?
Yeah, I mean, she's absolutely right. I mean, there's talk that the new variant has been in Western countries for several weeks. Because obviously by the time that that's reported, you have a delay anyway in terms of incubation and sequencing and so on and so forth. I mean, the reality is that travel bans are a very visible way for politicians to show that they are doing something. Because obviously when there's media coverage, then there's a lot of demands for to be doing something and to be taking tough action. And this is a very visible way of doing that. And she's right, the burden is falling on African countries. They're effectively being penalised for their transparency in discovering the variant in the first place, and it's too late. The vaccine has already escaped other countries, and her wider point is, of course, right. That we're going to keep on going round and round and round in circles like this until we effectively, manage to vaccinate the whole world.
Yeah, the message that I've seen coming out is we're not safe. We're not all safe until we're all safe, kind of thing, So you can't just lock this away. And I was quite disappointed by some of the commentary on Friday within our industry, sort of saying, well, South Africa isn't that big a market, we can kind of shut them off. And I think that was very naive to think that, first and foremost, that's the wrong thing to do. But secondly, that the variant wasn't already everywhere else, which has been proved the case over the last 3 days. So the people that said that now don't look so clever for saying it. But coming back to your point, one of the other things that I've seen, so I'm heavily involved in the Southern African social media side of things as well, is people feel... Why South Africa's got this amazing system of detecting these variants. Now a country's actively disincentivized from finding these and sharing that information. And what does that mean for the recovery? And that's what's making South Africans and Southern Africans so angry. It's like, well, we found it and we're being punished. Whereas I'm sure if this had been a doctor in a different country, they're sort of thinking, well, wait a sec, we wouldn't be punished the same way. We'd be lauded as finding this variant and then let's get to the bottom of it, rather than, as the doctor says, locking Africa away.
Yeah, I think it's worth, in terms of travel bans, taking a step back and why do they happen? As we said, whenever there's alarmist, media coverage about, oh no, there's a new variant, it's going to be more dangerous, and et cetera, then there's a demand on them to take action. And I think if we look at a UK context, where John, obviously you and me are based, is that I think the government felt that it had its fingers burnt with Delta, when they were criticised very loudly for supposedly not closing the door on India soon enough. Now whether that would have made any difference, had they had a travel ban sooner, is open to question. So I guess this time it was, better safe than sorry, and they reacted very, very quickly. And let's be practical, maybe also a little bit cynical. Is that if you are going to impose measures and we seem to be doing something, most people are not traveling. Only I know we're coming up to Christmas season, but only a minority of people are traveling right now, and even only a minority of people have got Christmas holidays booked. Most people, however, are going to restaurants, they are going to pubs, they are sending their children to schools, they are getting on buses. This is something that that can be done, that makes it look as if you're doing something, but has the lowest cost to disrupting people's everyday lives. And that comes back to a second point about whether travel bans are effective or not. And I know that obviously that in our industry we are anti-travel bans, but it's not as easy to say, well, that they don't work. They can work, and there's been a report done by a group of academics from Pandemics Without Borders and saying, well, they can work, but only if complemented by very tough domestic measures, at the same time, and only if case rates are already low. So if case rates are high, and you're imposing a travel ban on other countries, then it doesn't actually matter because community transmission is very, very high. Now, the lesson from Australia and New Zealand, there were obviously the model that they had was very, very problematic. But the fact of the matter is they did keep case rates down for a long period of time. But they combined, international and domestic measures together. So they did have a very tough quarantine regime, but they also had a very tough domestic regime where Melbourne was under lockdown for 5 months, for just a handful of cases. And of course, for those type of measures to be introduced, in the UK or the US or much of Western Europe today, people would find it unpalatable. So if you're going to do a travel ban, it has to be total, and it has to be to be combined with with some very tough domestic restrictions. That we thought that most people thought that they'd seen the end of, especially as they're coming up to Christmas. Just one more thing in terms of how countries are banning tourists. Now, it's true that most of the burden has fallen on Southern Africa, but Switzerland, for example, has introduced quarantine for travellers from I believe Belgium, Netherlands, the UK, and a few other countries. Now, someone pointed out to me, Switzerland has land borders with 5 countries. Switzerland is in the Schengen area. Switzerland has workers traveling backwards and forwards across those borders every single day. And that's just an example of how senseless restrictions like that are. Here in the UK, as it's often said, sort of even when we had quarantine earlier in the year, we still had 7,000 trucks coming through the Channel Tunnel every single day. And you have to wonder, about how practical it is to sort of close your borders off when the supply chains that are still moving, that you basically need, to keep modern life going on a day-to-day basis.
Absolutely. I think a couple of things on that. One is the politicians exist to serve the electorate, and so they've got to look after domestic issues first. So like you say, keeping schools, bars, restaurants open is much more important and shows that they're trying to do something to deal with it. The second thing is obviously in the Australia and New Zealand example, the thing they didn't do in that time was vaccinate. And then they had to try and catch up before they could open. They had to get to a certain level. So I just wanted to ask you the question on this. It's on topic, but the absolute difference in the way that island destinations have dealt with this pandemic versus those with land borders. Because like you say, Switzerland can do what they want, but it's very, very difficult to police. If you're an island, we work with Madagascar. If you're an island like Madagascar, you're not going to get there by boat feasibly. You can, obviously, but there are not so many arrivals. And you're only going to arrive by air. So it's quite easy to say we can stop this by just stopping flights. Have you seen that as a general trend, that island destinations have been much more conservative and because there's pressure on them to say, well, the only way this disease is coming in is through these ports of entry being only aviation, only airports?
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's sort of, especially in the Far East and the Asia Pacific region. I mean, we talk about New Zealand, but of course, a prime example is Taiwan, which had a zero COVID strategy, and which also, sort of restricted entry very, very heavily into the country, for sort of a longer period of time, and had some success in keeping the virus down. I guess it's sort of, the one thing that Taiwan as well as New Zealand shows is that even there, eventually Delta got through, looking at the sort of at the previous variant. So perhaps the lesson there is that you can slow things down, but you can't, sort of seal things off forever. Unless you are going to be, a number, I believe, of Pacific countries that are very, very isolated, like Tonga or Kiribati, or so on and so forth, have managed to completely seal themselves off. But it's the likes of Taiwan and New Zealand haven't. In terms of other island countries, like sort of in the Caribbean, it's of course a different situation because they're heavily dependent on tourism. So it's not been practical for them to, to seal themselves off in the same way. And then if we look at Iceland, the picture in Iceland has been quite mixed. I mean, you talk about vaccinations, Iceland has been very successful in vaccinating a high proportion of its population. And if you remember, there's sort of been a stop-start strategy. At times they've been quite open, and at times they've shut the doors again, depending on what was going on in the wider world.
Another interesting observation I saw somewhere on LinkedIn is that from a certain perspective, it's difficult to understand that, for example, UK is imposing travel bans on South Africa, whereas the total number of cases is much higher in UK than in South Africa. Absolutely,
and that's something that a year ago there was a study done by academics from the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine that was published in the Lancet about travel bans, and again it made this point saying that travel bans are not effective if your community transmission rates are already high, which is the case in the UK, and also obviously the case of most of Western and Northern Europe. It doesn't make a difference. They only work, when your rates of community transmission is low, because then you're trying to seal yourself off and sort of doing an importation of cases and protecting the situation in your domestic market. So going back to what we talked about Australia and New Zealand, with the point that John made that they were a bit late out of the gates in terms of vaccinations. They did have a certain amount of success, certainly during 2020, in keeping community transmission down and marrying tough domestic restrictions on one hand and obviously international controls on the other, with no land borders, which obviously going back to Switzerland is sort of a problem that Switzerland, for example, has.
And one other question for you is, when the decision was made last Thursday night by the UK government, it didn't seem to me like there was any sort of unilateral agreement here, because the WHO came out the next day and saying you shouldn't do this, etc. And I guess what I'm saying is, on a global stage, what this has shown, this pandemic, is just how there is a lack of coordination and a lack of sort of unilateral action and a lack of respect almost for these global institutions. They're not listened to at the beginning. They don't go and speak to them and then say, what should we do? We're making decisions on a domestic basis in our interest. So is that something that what are your thoughts on that, I suppose, in terms of the efficiency and the efficacy of these actual bodies that are there as World Health Organizations or whatever it may be?
Yeah, I mean, it comes back to your point that you made earlier that that Western democratic governments are sort of answer to their own domestic populations and their own domestic media. And I guess it's sort of that the priority, probably in the minds of, if we take the UK for an example, the UK government on Thursday night was to generate, sort of positive headlines in the Mail and the Telegraph and so on, that they were doing something, and that will always, unfortunately, trump, sort of the advice coming out of organisations such as the WHO, because it's always about keeping one step ahead of the of domestic pressures, and also sort of closing off criticism from opponents, because one thing that you can see in a lot of Western countries is that calling for travel bans as an opposition politician is a very good way to outflank the people in power by making them seem soft, in terms of pandemic controls. So again, here in the UK, we had a letter yesterday, obviously from from the Scottish First Minister and her Welsh counterpart, calling for a return to the situation we had back in April, of the mandatory 10-day quarantine for everyone coming into the country. Similarly, I saw that Lisa Nandy, the Labour politician who was until recently Shadow Foreign Secretary, she was also calling for tougher controls. So, unfortunately, governments do have to deal with these domestic pressures, and of course, travel bans and border closures just for a lot of the population, it just feels right. Instinctively, just in their heads, they just think, we just shut the borders down, we stop people from abroad coming over, and it'll be okay. Whereas, of course, it's a complex issue, and things don't, of course, work like that in the real world.
In a certain way, it feels like a déjà vu. We've seen it all before, and obviously we don't have a crystal ball, and neither have you, but you've been following this topic very closely for the last 18-20 months. So what do you think will happen in the next 2-3 weeks? Do you think we can expect even borders being closed within Europe, as we've seen there are already in more than 10 European countries the new variant was already detected?
I mean, I would like to be optimistic and to say that this is the end of it. But I think, as you say, that experience has taught us that the politicians will come under increasing pressure to be seen to be doing something, as we said, and closing borders is a very effective way of doing that. So unfortunately, I mean, so I can see further border closures ahead, especially if in 2 weeks' time, if the news that comes out about vaccine escape versus the new variant is not good. But of course, it comes back to, as you say, we've been here before, and I think that that as an industry we need to take a step back and to say, are we going to be doing this again and again and again and again? So working our way through the Greek alphabet all the way until we get to to the Omega variant, maybe in sometime in 2023. Because the fact of the matter is, much of the world is not vaccinated. Obviously John knows a lot about sub-Saharan Africa. Vaccination rates there are very, very low. And variants arise in populations that are part vaccinated or not vaccinated at all. I mean, I think I saw one piece of coverage in one of the Australian papers saying that some of the South Pacific islands won't see 50% vaccination until 2023. And that provides a sort of a recipe for this to happen over and over. And so I think that what IATA did, where they called for, where they took a step back and they called for a more data-driven and sort of more rational approach to pandemics in future, I think is the right way to go. We need to be thinking ahead now to the next one after this, because this is going to happen again. There will be a new variant in 6 months, 9 months, 12 months time, and we'll be going through the same thing. And I think that it's incumbent on the industry to come up with a strategy, where we can stop this in the tracks and sort of come up with lobby governments for a better way to deal with variants when they emerge.
I think the issue on the back of that is just this huge disconnect that I think we all experience between industry and government. So us at AviaDev, we lobby for, in Africa, open skies, etc. But the governments don't come to our forums very often. So we're preaching to the choir, and there's a disconnect. I mean, you think about IATA. IATA created the travel pass. It's still trialed here and trialed there. And I tried to use it on my last flight, didn't have a code, I don't know. So it didn't happen. It hasn't become the industry standard. So you've got this fragmentation. So, this is the thing is we need a body that's either strong enough or respected enough that everybody says, this is the way forward. Let's get behind this. Let's do the same thing in terms of fixing this, because at the moment that approach is so fragmented. And I suppose just to your point that you just made, I suppose the best case scenario is that we do the homework on this new variant. We say, look, it's prevalent, it's here, but it's not so bad. We can go on and we can continue to survive within this, and those countries hopefully can keep those people out of hospital, and that won't put the pressure on the health system, because that's always been the issue in the UK is we don't want our health system to be overwhelmed when already it's winter time and people are ill anyway, and they've been holding back illnesses because of the pandemic. There's already a backlog. We were already under pressure. That's the big thing that, again, is a domestic vote winner or vote loser. If suddenly the government here in the UK is seen that their health system is overrun, and they've done that at the expense of keeping borders open, they're not going to be in for the next election. And let's be honest, that's what really matters.
Okay, I think that's it for today. Thank you very much, Dirk, for all your insights. And let's hope in the next 2 weeks, you think, we will have a bit more information about how vaccines are effective and how bad really this new variant is.
Yeah, I mean that's what Tony Fauci said in the weekend interviews in the US. That we will know within about a fortnight. How bad or how not so bad things are in terms of the vaccine escape.
Okay, so let's hope for the best, prepare for the worst. Thank you very much, Dirk. Again, appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Dirk.